Tamara is an award-winning author and expert on organizations, the changing workforce, and generations at work. Her 30 years as a researcher and advisor have focused on helping individuals and companies alike succeed in the changing workforce. Her work is highly regarded in the business world. One of the articles that she co-authored for the Harvard Business Review has earned her the McKinsey Award, which is an award that honors pieces that are most likely to be influential in the business world across countries, across cultures. So in addition to her published work, Tamara also maintains a weekly blog on the Harvard Business Publishing website, so you can learn a little bit more about her work there. Without further ado, please welcome Tamara Erickson.
I started out looking at the workforce and how it was changing probably about 7 years ago now, and my first question was really just, what are the numbers like? Will we have enough people, too many people? How are they going to match up with jobs? But the more I got into it, the more it became clear that what people wanted from work was also really different. The people that we were interviewing about what they wanted from work, and it began to break down by generation. It turns out that each generation is, or each of us, I should say, because of course the generations are just a bit of an artificial divide, but each of us is very heavily influenced by the things that happen to us when we're kids. It turns out that those teenage experiences, kind of between the ages of, say, 11 and 13, have a very significant impact on how most of us think about the world, because that's when we tend to look up, if you will, for the first time. You know, before that we've been little kids playing with our toys, figuring out how our toys work. But sometime around 11 to 13, we kind of look up and listen to what our parents are talking about, you know, maybe listen to TV, figure out what's going on TV. And the stuff we hear, we process and begin to put together our own picture of how things work. And because each generation obviously sees very different things, each of us sees quite different things, we tend to form different impressions. So we're all different. Obviously, it depends a bit on our parents and where we grew up, what country, and so forth. But there tend to be a few similarities, and that's what gives generations their interesting traits. So let me give you one example. People who are, let's say, 63 and above today, are people that I call traditionalists, that generation. Those are people who would have been little kids during World War II. So they would probably have had parents, if they lived in the United States, who remembered the Depression. They maybe had rationing when they were little kids. But by the time they became teenagers, the world was in their world was in a post-World War II economic boom. So they would have woken up to consumer goods, washing machines, parents who talked about what the Joneses down the street perhaps are, you know, just purchasing, suburbs, all that kind of stuff going on. Now, how would you imagine a kid would process that? How would a kid think about life if their teenage experiences were ones of growth and opportunity? Probably be pretty upbeat, wouldn't they? What would they want to do? What would be a logical life goal? What do you think you'd want to do if you were a 13-year-old, kind of looking at all of that, listening to your parents talking about it? What do you imagine? Sure. Try everything out. Get your own house. Get your own washing machine. You'd want to join it, right? You'd want to be part of it. You'd want to figure out a way to get into all of this, get a piece of it for yourself. That tends to be a very common impression that a lot of people of that generation who grew up in the United States, I have to emphasize, particularly at this point in time, at this point in history, different countries were going through very different experiences. I mean, India, for example, had just become a country, just, in other words, spun off from the UK with its own independent nation. So totally different kind of experience going on in India and Pakistan. China was just finishing its civil war about this time. Again, very different kind of experience. But my point is, whichever experience, if you think about what it would have been like to be a kid, let's say a kid in China, who's growing up as the Civil War is coming to an end. You have communism taking over. You have a lot of the traditions that your parents held dear kind of being put by the side as progress, so to speak, takes over. Think about what that would have felt like and how people who grew up in that might have reacted. All right, let me take you back to the U.S. So the next generation is one that we typically call boomers, after the fact that there were a lot of them. I'm one of them, I must admit. Now, boomers, when they were teens in the United States, saw Vietnam. It was the first televised war. So a lot of boomers would have come home from high school or whatever and watched Vietnam on television. They would have seen the civil rights movement. They would have seen the assassinations of Kennedy and King. Most boomers can still remember exactly where they were when one of those events happened. Lots of turmoil, protests, civil disobedience. What kind of impressions would you think a 13-year-old would form if you were a teen at that time? Yeah, very logical, right? The point is, not really a world you'd want to join as is. I mean, the generation before maybe looked at things and said, man, I want to get a part of that. This generation is much more likely to say, things are not going all that well. It needs to change, and I need to play an active role in helping it change. It turns out that in the history of relationships between parent and child, boomers and their parents tended to, shall we say, not see eye to eye, maybe more than any two generations, because you've got one of joiners and one of changers. Very different kind of outlook toward the world. Okay, next generation I call Gen X. I suspect many of you here fall in Gen X. I define Gen X as people who are born between about 1961 and 1979 or 80. Now again, those cutoffs are obviously not precise. If you're near the cusp, you would have been influenced by a variety of different things from both groups. It's a little different definition than many people use. Many people kind of start Gen X at around 1965. But I think a lot of people who were born in the 60 to 65 group don't want to be boomers. Do we have anyone here who falls in that category, 60 to 65 birth dates? Well, Barack Obama does, and I don't think he's readily associating with boomers. But a lot of people in that group seem to be positioning with the Gen X, the next generation coming along. Okay, Gen X childhood was marked by social change. Gen X is a time when we saw women entering the workforce for the first time in significant numbers. Perhaps many of you saw your moms entering. That was a time when, as a society, we didn't have any infrastructure to support that. So there was no child care, there were no nanny networks, there was no corporate daycare, none of the kind of things we have today. So some of you probably became latchkey kids, home alone in the afternoon, really taking care of yourself, very independent, maybe taking care of younger siblings, hanging out with your friends, etc. That was a very common experience for many in Gen X. Divorce rates also skyrocketed when Gen Xers were teens. So when Gen Xers were little kids, divorce rates were low. They were about 20%. And as you became teens, they jumped to 50%. So it was a massive change in a very short period of time, meaning that even if your family didn't experience divorce, it probably, surely someone around you did. Very common experience. The other common experience of Gen X is most of you probably knew an adult who was laid off from a corporation that he or she had planned to work with for the rest of their life. That's also a very experience among many who grew up in Gen X in the United States, because this is the time, the 80s, when you would have been teens, when we saw corporate layoffs, restructuring. changing the social contract, all of that kind of stuff going on. So how would a 13-year-old process that? What do you think? What kind of thoughts would go through a 13-year-old's mind? Now, some of you were 13-year-olds in the 1980s. I know you were. What went through your mind? How'd the world look to you? Come on, guys. What do you think? Change? Instability? Right. Institutions maybe that people were counting on that are kind of changing around you? And what would it say about your life goals? How do you think about life? What's important to you? Security. Stability, right? The ability to be secure. I've talked to many, many people in Generation X over the last couple of years in particular, because that's actually the next book I'm writing. This one that you have today is written for Gen Y. But the next one I'm writing for Gen X, and I've talked to lots of Gen Xers. I think the phrase that I hear almost universally, and you guys tell me if you would agree, is at some point, almost every Gen X person I interview will say, if something bad were to happen. That phrase comes up very often in conversations when people are talking about their life plans. They want to be able to deal with if something bad were to happen. It's that sense of the unknown, of uncertainty, of kind of being able to react and respond if something unexpected came along. So I think it would be incorrect to say that all Gen Xers want to be entrepreneurial or all Gen Xers want to be independent. I don't find that. But I do find Gen Xers want to have the ability to respond if something bad were to happen, which for many means you want to have a lot of options. So many times when I interview Gen Xers, they'll say to me, well, I'm doing this today, but I've got this going on the side, and I'm starting up this, and I've thought about that, and I'm going to school for this. So they've got like 5 things going on, 5 different kind of money-making ideas that they're all kind of working simultaneously at different levels of intensity. That's very distinctive of many in Gen X, and frankly, very unusual for boomers. You wouldn't find very many boomers who just think that way. That's not how they do. So that would be one trait of Gen X that I think comes out of that, that kind of a background. Now, what's the importance of generational analysis? Well, one thing I would suggest is that we often run into situations where we misunderstand each other because we're looking at something from our own lens. One thing that was true about boomers that I didn't actually mention when we were talking about them is boomers, of course, also grew up with lots of other boomers. This is a boom. This is a big group of people. I went to high school in a temporary trailer out behind the high school building because there weren't enough seats. That's a very common experience for boomers. The infrastructure wasn't big enough. So boomers have always grown up in a world in which there weren't enough seats for everybody, in which you had to compete. Boomers are quite competitive, in case you haven't noticed. So let's just imagine for a minute a situation that a lot of companies come in contact with, which is they want somebody to relocate. So let's imagine some of you get that call. Now, we don't have any boomers, I bet, in the audience. Doesn't look like it to me. But let me just tell you, if somebody comes into a boomer's office, and says, we want you to relocate to corporate headquarters, how do you think a boomer would react? What would a boomer say? Yes, sir, and not only yes, sir, but yeah, right, you got it. How high? And there'd be a sense of yay, because it means I must have won, right? Somebody picked me. Out of all the other people they could have chosen for this, I won. So a boomer would generally view this as really good news. Now, hassle, all that kind of stuff, but generally really good news. So now let's imagine a boomer walks into an Xer's office. The boomer is walking in, I have to tell you, assured that you're going to jump up and down with joy. They're going to be giving you news that you are going to be so happy about. So the boomer walks in full of confidence, tells you that you're being relocated to the corporate headquarters, and you say, what? Yeah, you get lots of lukewarm responses to negative from many Xers, not all, of course. And the underlying rationale is that for many of you, that feels like it's cutting off some of your options, cutting off your community, maybe a sense of, you know, why didn't they ask me is probably one of the most important reactions. Why didn't this guy ask me before he came up with this harebrained idea? Very different kind of reaction than what a boomer would have. Those things happen all the time at work. And that causes us then to form negative judgments of each other. Because what would happen to the boomer once the Xer had given a lukewarm reaction? What would the boomer think of the Xer? Yeah, they'd think, what are they thinking? Think, why did I go out of my way for this guy? You know, they're not grateful for the support that I've given them. They'd form a negative judgment in many cases that would be completely unwarranted. It's not fair, but it would be kind of a instinctive reaction because they're looking at the situation through their lens. And at the same time, the Xer may think the boomer is just, I don't know, arrogant, insensitive, all of those kind of things because they're looking at it through their lens. When you look at the book Plugged In, you'll see that it contains actually a number of situations that those of us who are not wise often confuse when we're in situations with wise. That's basically what a lot of the book is about. It's talking with wise about what are X's like and what are boomers likely to be like, and how are you going to get tripped up when you encounter them in the workplace? How are they going to look at things differently? One common one there might be that, let's say, for example, that the wise parent in some way is visible throughout the recruiting process. Now, how would that seem to a Y? What do you think a Y would think if they were aware that their parent had sent in their resume or called to arrange an appointment? Yes. No, that's totally right. Absolutely spot on. Thanks, Mom. You know, it was a sensible use of a resource that could pitch in when you're busy. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it in the wise frame of mind. How would a boomer look at that? Probably would think, you know, gee, maybe this kid can't take care of themselves, you know, all that kind of yada yada. Unfair. And that's part of the work that I do with groups is to say, you know, unfair to form those judgments. So don't do that. Don't fall in that trap. A couple quick words about wise. They saw as one of their most prominent events when they were 13, terrorism in school. Those were their formative events. Now, the interesting thing about terrorism and school violence as opposed to war has an expectation of something bad. In other words, if you're going to go off to war, there's at least some reasonable expectation that most mature people would have that something bad could happen. If you go to school, there is no reasonable expectation that something bad could happen. So for wise, they grew up in a world where unexpected things happen to random people at random times. They grew up in a world that was random. And the single biggest complaint that I get from employers about Gen Ys is that they're too impatient. My argument back is that Ys aren't really impatient per se, not quite in the way boomers at least would conceive it. What they are is immediate, because if you grew up in a random world, what's the sensible way to live your life? In the moment, absolutely. That's a completely logical way to do it. I would think any Y who doesn't kind of feel in the moment, I'd be surprised because it's a completely logical way to live your life if your mental framework says random things could happen. So the concept that Ys don't, defer gratification or, all those kind of things that older generations sometimes talk about make a lot of sense to me. And again, that's part of what you'll find in the book is a conversation about the way that something that is very natural for that generation, the sense of living in the now, can sometimes be misinterpreted by Gen X and Boomer colleagues who say, boy, this person is way too impatient. They need to settle down, pay their dues, etc. And therefore you get kind of a clash that makes both parties less than fully happy in the workplace. My suggestion with regard to Ys is that companies recognize they want to live fully in the now and basically give them opportunities to do so. I don't think you can kind of slow down a moving train. I think Ys are going to want to have very challenging work quickly, continually. They're going to want to be able to figure things out. And companies that are successful in giving them those kind of really intense learning environments are the ones that will be much more successful in holding on to Ys for a longer period of time. That's the basic thesis behind the work I do. So it's looking back at people's teen experiences and then trying to understand how those teenage experiences shape how people approach work today and where we're going to get into trouble because we might misunderstand each other. Any thoughts or questions? What do you think? Yes. Okay. That's what we think. Well, we're a small group. Yeah. Or I can repeat the question. Right, right. Well, the question is, what advice would I give to Ys about kind of gaining more challenging work? How do you communicate that to people? And I think that, first of all, let me just make a philosophical comment because you really said it very well, that there's a bit of a balancing act. I think Ys are going to bring so much to the workplace. They have so much to offer. But I also think they can easily be frustrated by the workplace they find in many places. That may not be true here, I don't know. But in many corporations, I can tell you, Ys are going to pull their hair out when they really figure out how those places operate. So for Ys, I think the challenge is both to understand how the place works well enough that they can actually, you've got to understand something before you can change it. So part of the message is understand how the place you've arrived at functions, understand what the unwritten rules are, why people do things the way they do, pay attention to that, but by all means try to change it. I mean, don't accept it as status quo and it's always got to be that way. So in terms of, finding more challenging work, I would suggest, as with most things, simply being very clear and articulate about what it is you want. I learn best when I have a problem that I can figure out, for example. I'd like to have some assignments where the methodology for doing them is something that I could have a role in figuring out because that's a way that I learn. So the more you can articulate kind of the characteristics around it, the better. Here's another good example. One of the interesting differences I find is around the word feedback, which actually has quite different meanings, I'm convinced. If you think, let me just talk about boomers for a second. I can tell you what it means to a boomer. If a boomer goes into his or her boss's office to get some feedback. What that really means is I'm going to be judged. I'm going to receive an evaluation. I probably will not talk at all. The boss will tell me whether I get a gold star or not. So it's an evaluative process. That is not the kind of thing one normally wants to go through very often. Once a year would be plenty for most of us. So now, all of a sudden, you have these Ys in the workplace who say 3 times a day, could you give me some feedback? And the boomer bosses are going, what is wrong with this person? I told you yesterday you're doing fine. You're still doing fine. You know, I'll tell you a year from now how fine you're doing, but please, no more on the feedback. And what I try to explain is what they're saying, I think. And so you shouldn't use the word feedback is you're really saying, teach me something. You're really asking, in most cases, the other person to give me a tip. Share a way that I could have done this better. Tell me, teach me. And you're not, because feedback means judge me. You're saying, teach me. So some of it has to do with sorting through the semantics well enough that you click into those old boomer brains what it really is that you're asking them to do. Does that make sense? Okay. Anything else? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I've done it a lot of different ways, actually, over the 7 or 8 years. I'm sorry. The question was, how do I get information from managers? Through surveys, through interviews, etc. And the answer is I've done it through kind of all of the above. We have done statistical surveys. We've actually done several very successful ones through online sources like Harris Online Poll, etc. Um, but I find in many ways I get more of the subtle nuance through personal interview because then I can really listen to the language the person chooses to use and probe into why they chose that word over another word to describe kind of the feeling that they're having about something. So I do a lot of personal interviewing. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah. So the question is, does the perception of whys in traditional fields like law and medicine differ? Not really, I would say. In fact, I think some of the organizations that are probably under the most pain at the moment, if I had to pick one, I'd pick law firms. Whys are wreaking havoc in law firms because they don't like kind of the old apprentice system, and they're not willing to put up with it. And so they're being quite vocal about their preferences, particularly women lawyers who have very strong views, but also male lawyers about how they want to structure their career. So I think that even in some of the, maybe more classically traditional professions where you might think someone with a very conservative bent would be attracted, that hasn't proven out to be true. You get a lot of people who want to create change going into many of those professions. Now, they do tend to vary in some other interesting characteristics, and actually I talk about that a bit in the book. Um, they tend to vary in terms of what they want back. So some people really care a lot about contributing to society, and some people care a lot about being part of a team and having fun as part of a team, etc. And you find those variations often by industry. People tend to gravitate to different industries depending upon their perception of what you get back from doing that work. But the fundamental sense of wanting to change organizations to be more flexible, more human, more challenging, less apprentice-oriented, more learning-oriented is something I find pretty much across the board. What else? Yes. Okay. All right. Okay, that's a good one. So the friction between Gen Y and Gen X um, usually goes like this. The Gen X has been assigned to manage the Gen Y. The Gen Y doesn't understand the etiquette associated with being managed in a corporation. So the Gen Y basically ricochets around the corporation, sending messages, touching base with people he or she thinks would be important to contribute to the work they're doing all sorts of things that you would probably view as reasonably logical if you're a Y. Of course, you're going to seek people who have information, you're going to share information, but this other poor person who views their role as one of kind of managing things is all of a sudden out of the loop. So the X is in the cafeteria, bumps into the big boss who says, hey, I just got a very interesting note from, you know, Mr. Y Joe here who suggested something. And the X has no idea what they're talking about. Those are the kind of things that I find kind of creating tension. It's a sense of what X's believe they've been asked to do in corporations and the way Ys are perhaps not respecting the pressure that's on the X. So again, it's kind of understanding each other's perspective. Many X's are in roles where they're being held accountable for stuff. That, you know, they'll be in hot water if, you know, certain things don't happen. And Ys don't necessarily get that and kind of provide the connection that the X's need to manage successfully. That can be a big issue there. The other, I think, more subtle fear that happens in some corporations is many X's worry that the Ys will leapfrog them. In other words, that the X has been kind of in, particularly in older corporations. Maybe they've been sitting there for a long time behind a big group of boomers, hoping and praying for the day the boomers will finally retire. And just when they think those dratted boomers are just about to retire, here's this big group of chipper, energetic, you know, charming Ys who are, you know, asking to jump right over the top. And that's, I think, the more subtle fear that many X's have, which, you know, may or may not be a valid one. But it's certainly, because X's in many cases have been waiting a long time, it's something that they can feel some concern about. Yes. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we don't know enough yet about how Gen Y women will react to that. Quickly, for those of you who haven't had a chance to read the book, I do think that many Ys, because you grew up with working mothers, the fact that mothers work is like a, you know, duh, non-event. It's not, it's not interesting. Of course women can work. Of course mothers can work. In my case, it was a really interesting and exciting idea, the idea that mothers would work. But for many Ys, it's really no big deal at all. So Ys are not as motivated in many cases to prove that women could do it. It's pretty well accepted that women can work full-time and rear children if they choose to do that. So you've kind of got two issues. One is, can you work full-time and rear children? That, I think, Ys don't wonder about. It can be done. You know what the sacrifices are. You watch the sacrifices in many cases. You can make your own decision about whether that's something you want to do. The fact that once you're there, it's hard, and it's harder than for men in some cases, I think makes many Ys feel more discouraged and more wanting to put energies in other places. That's my concern. So one of the things I work with corporations about is to say, if you want why women, and I think you definitely do, want why women, they get more college degrees than why men. So if you want the college crowd, you need to tap the women. You're going to have very family-friendly, supportive workplaces that make them good places for women to work. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. So the question is, how large is the sample size, and how do you differ between, tell the difference between anecdotal stories and large-scale trends? And the essential answer is by doing both. So you have to do the large-scale, statistically valid surveys in order to get kind of a grounding of, um, as you say, what the overall trend is. But what you can't really tell from that, at least I'm never quite satisfied, is why. You'll know that that 52% of the people said something, but you don't know why. And that I get from talking with people. And there is a little bit of, I mean, it's possible that the people I talk to have one particular view on why that no one else would share. But when you tend to do, let's say, even 20 interviews, and they're all very consistent, the odds that you're not going to find some huge pocket that's wildly different, I think becomes much more, much more comfortable in terms of coming to those conclusions. That said, I do want to emphasize again, generational analysis should be taken just as one clue, because the real point is we each formed impressions when we were 11 to 13. That there's been a ton of research on. That actually comes out of developmental psychology. People like Jean Piaget and others did tons of research to show that our conceptual ideas are formed when we're 11 to 13. Obviously, what happened when you were 11 to 13 and when someone else was 11 to 13, even if it was the same year, could be quite different based on your parents' politics or your socioeconomic status or, a host of other things. It could be very, very different. So you have to take all of it with, it's a thread. It's an interesting thread worth thinking about, but the importance of understanding what motivates each individual sure is overwhelming. Other thoughts? Well, if not, I apologize again for being confused on my directions. I'm glad that I was able to make it here with you, and thank you for spending an afternoon to talk. What do you guys think of all this? Give me your honest feedback. Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's good. One quick comment, if I might share with you. I think for those of you who have, I doubt any of you have kids in this age group, but if you do, or if you have younger siblings, I think kids who are 13 today will not be wise. I think it will cut off because I think this year is so different. I think they are experiencing a very different 13-year-old life than the wise did. Because they're, of course, right in the middle of such a, I think of it as a bucket of cold ice water. I mean, they are, being doused with reality of recessions and renewable energy, resource shortage. They're reading stories about penguins and melting polar ice caps, and, they're studying water shortages in geography in school. So, I mean, they're coming up in a very, kind of cold light of day, um, framework. It's going to feel, I think, very different. I don't know exactly how they'll turn out, but I think they're going to be very realistic, very pragmatic, no nonsense, because I think they're going to have formed their models around some pretty hard truths. I'm suggesting we call them the regeneration. So regens. I think we're tired of X and Y. We don't need a Z. So, well, thank you again.